I don't think Julian Assange needs any kind of introduction. This book, Cyberfunks, came out. It's a transcription of a bunch of conversations. Came out after he was already under indictment, or at least after there were extradition efforts made by both the United States and Sweden and the U.S. for violating national security. I'm not sure what the exact charge was. This is over the publicizing the Chelsea Manning leaks, and in Sweden on rape charges. So, yeah. So I think it's worth engaging. The section I had you read was specifically about policy, which might not seem like the obvious match, right? I mean, he starts out this book kind of echoing a lot of this, a lot of what you see in the Cyberfunks manifesto. His background, he came out of Australia, where he had been had engaged in some hacking, been charged and convicted of breaking into a system, had worked with the police to help to fight against pedophiles making use of the internet. So, and then had eventually contributed to a bunch of, especially crypto projects, and established about six years before this. This site that was meant to publicize leaks, and had gotten into some trouble already, although his kind of global difficulties began with the leaks that Chelsea Manning handed over to WikiLeaks and that he distributed. He and his group distributed. But here he's talking mostly about, it might seem like it's a bit of a mismatch, right? Because he's talking about, ACTA and which is the European version of SOPA and PIPA. Both SOPA and then PIPA were shot down, although a lot of the provisions in them, as everyone had predicted at the time, a lot of the provisions in them have lived on afterwards. And these are all sort of extensions of the DMCA and efforts to stop piracy. I mean, that's kind of what they're aimed for, to protect trademarks, some combination of those two, protect intellectual property in some way. So it seems like a weird thing for them to be focused on. But that's because although that is the sort of the named target, and it certainly was supported by folks like the Motion Picture Association of America, although that was definitely a big thrust of it, it also was used to shut down WikiLeaks, which seems strange because it wasn't an intellectual property issue. But it did allow for them to have new instruments of control. So one of the problems we've had with national governments is they don't really have instruments of control. And in fact, cryptographic systems and the deep web and Tor and those kinds of things disrupt that even more. I mean, it makes it incredibly difficult for governments to kind of enact something, to control, to stop. You can't. The sole, governments, national governments have this legitimate use of, legitimate monopoly on violence, right? But that's physical violence. They don't really have the same kind of traction in online worlds. And so one of the places they can kind of exert some leverage is by disturbing access. And so this, for the first time, gave these acts gave national governments, in this case, either in Europe or in the U.S., the ability to basically delist sites that any company had claimed was violating their intellectual property, without any real due process. It was bad. It was bad legislation, and also kind of disrupt the ability to make payments to someone. And that was the one that certainly the WikiLeaks folks were upset about, because when they were unable to shut down WikiLeaks from a distance, the government moved in and said that banks could not process charges to WikiLeaks. And this was at a time before people had easy access to other alternative currencies. And so it definitely was a way of kind of disrupting what WikiLeaks was doing. I think it's worth noting this argument here, which is central to a lot of the discussion about both censorship on the one hand and crypto on the other. And the thing is, strong cryptography is an extraordinarily potent weapon, and there isn't any good counter to it. And they bring up this idea of the four horsemen, right? Anytime you say, well, we can have the deep web, we can have Tor, we can have these ways of routing around governments and disrupting their ability to censor a topic, right, or censor a network. The first thing that people think about are these four horsemen, and I don't know that I'll remember offhand what they are, but they're kind of criminal organizations, terrorism, child pornography, and I'm sure there's one more there have to be four of them, right? And honestly, the example they give is Tunisia, and saying, well, yes, those are dangers, but here's the other danger, which is governments can completely censor things. That's a really hard case to make in the U.S., right? This goes back to that whole issue of Europe's more recent issues with fascist governments, right, and police states, and the U.S. hasn't had that direct experience yet. We can't say, well, remember when you had this happen on the internet and you were unable to get any information at all, or you weren't allowed to communicate with each other or something like that. I guess there are some very narrow cases in which you could say that to certain people in the US, but for the vast majority of us, we've never had this experience of having something directly censored by the government. We don't have that same handhold on that. And so we have to think in these abstract terms. In the concrete sense, I could get online right now on Tor and find child pornography. I could get online and buy drugs and have them shipped to me. I could get online and put out a hit on someone, right? That's very tangible. That's something I can do right now. I'm not going to any of those things, but that's something that I could do, right? It's something that any of us can access with just a little bit of technical know-how, not very much actually, get access to that stuff. But the other side of it, I've never been in this position where I couldn't get access to information because the government had censored me. So they give this example of being in Tunisia and saying, how many of you in this room have kind of been exposed to the government shutting down access to something you need, and they could all say they had. And so for them, that question of the four horsemen is much easier. For us, those are going to be the scare ones. And it is a rhetorical approach to say these are the scary things that can happen if governments cannot control the internet. So, it is a scare tactic, but it's also true, right? That we have to have that bad going with the good. And for all the rhetoric around the First Amendment means free speech, there are definitely things that 99.9% of Americans say should not exist and should be censorable by the government. And so that's part of the crux that I wanted to get to here. Actually, there's some interesting intersections here in terms of the question of peer production. Like they have that discussion around Napster and whether Americans were more convinced by the idea they were stealing, or whether music culture could be this peer productive process and not just an industrial process. So there's that discussion. And then certainly that question around crypto and control. And so I think there's this, I'm not sure that I agree with very much of Assange's positions, let alone his kind of the personal issues, but his political kind of positions. I'm not sure where I align on that at all, but I do think that this conversation brings up some interesting questions that are worthwhile. And so that's why I was hoping you would look through it and find those questions and tease them out and figure out how you feel you fall on those issues and why. All right. Thank you.